Hi students, you're probably wondering why is this screen black? Well, in a few minutes we'll get to the PowerPoint, but one of the first things I want to kind of say to you guys is, and I said it before, but you guys have been such a wonderful class, probably the best, funnest class I've had, and if not all my teaching career, a really long time. And I really miss you guys. And it's a bummer that we can't meet face to face, but hopefully you all will attend some of my office hours so I can see your faces and hear your voices. Please know that through all of this, I got your back. And I'm going to do everything I can to help get you guys through the remainder of the semester. Okay? So let's go ahead and resume learning about muscles. I want to let you know that this is an abbreviated lecture. I took out some content that I would normally have included just because of the circumstances that we're under. Okay? So this is going to be much abbreviated, which I'm sure you guys are like, hooray, this is amazing. So let's get to it. Here's a picture from your textbook that shows you some confusing things. It looks like cylinders inside cylinders inside cylinders inside cylinders. And if you have done some studying and you've tried to learn this, you may have found yourself getting really confused about the anatomy of skeletal muscles. How are skeletal muscles put together? And the reason that the graphic is confusing is that, yeah, we do have a bunch of cylindrical structures stacked together and then wrapped in another cylindrical structure, which is wrapped in another cylindrical structure. So I get it. I totally understand where you're coming from. And so I'm going to help you guys really understand how skeletal muscles come together. And we're going to learn how they come together all the way from the molecular level all the way up to the organ level. And we're just going to do it one step at a time. Remember, how do you eat that elephant? You eat that elephant just one bite at a time, okay? So I'm going to draw something here for you guys that'll help you kind of keep in mind which level of organization is which and what the name of the structures are at each level of organization. So we're going to start from smallest to largest. We're going to start with just the proteins that come together inside of a cell to make a slightly larger structure. And then we'll move all the way up step by step. So if we start, I'm going to see if I can do this without running out of space. Myosin and actin. Those are names of proteins that come together into an organized structure called a sarcomere. And many sarcomeres come together to make what we call a myofibril. And many myofibrils come together to make a muscle cell. Another name for a muscle cell could be a muscle fiber. So know that you'll see both of those terms used. Many muscle cells come together to make what we call a fascicle. And many fascicles come together to make what we call a muscle. So let's look at the different levels of organization. I'll write the names out here for you, or the terms. So myosin and actin are proteins, right? So this is the molecular level of organization. A sarcomere is also at the molecular level of organization. Myofibrils are organelles. A muscle cell, as the name implies, is at the cellular level of organization. And a muscle fascicle is the tissue level of organization, and a muscle is at the organ level of organization. Okay, so remember our hierarchy of organization. Cells come together to make tissues, tissues come together to make organs, but we're going to start way down here at the molecular level and gradually work our way up. We're essentially building a muscle from the molecular level on up. Okay, so I'll revisit this graphic at the end just as a summary. But let's go ahead and look at those two proteins. Again, the molecular level of organization. Now, the two main protein types, we'll start out with the first one first, myosin. That's a name of this protein right here that has this shape. It's got two parts to it. It's got what we call a tail and a head, but this is just the general shape of that myosin protein. It kind of looks like a golf club almost. And those myosin molecules come together into slightly larger structures that are pretty thick. So often these clusters of myosin molecules are referred to as thick filaments. In the picture up on the top left-hand corner, I'll just switch colors. This entire structure is the next level of organization that we're going to look at, but I want to point out to you where the myosin molecules are in this. So these purple lines that you see right there, those are many myosin molecules. If we move to the next slide, we'll learn about the next type of protein, and that's called actin. Actin molecules have a totally different shape, so let's go ahead and I'll use a black pen here. Actin has more of a spiral shape where it almost looks like two beads of pearls or two strings of pearls twisted around one another. That's what actin looks like. And I'm just going to erase those markings there here real quick. Wow, that takes a long time. Okay, so those pink or peach colored beads that you see there, those are the different parts of the actin molecule. The entire two strings wound around one another, that's an actin molecule. For right now, ignore that green string-like molecule, and also, for now, ignore these little other proteins, these little brown beaded proteins. The actin protein is the two pink strings wound around one another. So if we look over at the picture on the left, those actin proteins are represented here as those red lines. So essentially what you see is this alternating pattern of arrangement between myosin and actin, myosin and actin. So let me change color here real quick. Okay, so we're going to kind of switch gears here, or kind of try and connect epimysium, perimysium, and endomysium. So if we look at the picture up on the left right here, where the red color ends, that's where the muscle cells end. Or that's where the muscle cells terminate. But we know that muscles as organs are anchored to bone, right? And they're anchored to bone via these structures that we call tendons. So all of this is a tendon. More specifically, that's the calcaneal tendon. And so what a tendon is made of is a continuation of the endomysium, the perimysium, and the epimysium. So right here where the muscle cells end, the fibers of the endomysium and the perimysium, they just continue on. They continue on as the tendon, and then ultimately those fibers weave into the periosteum of the bone, making a really tight connection. Here's just another picture showing you from a different author, just showing you those different levels of organization. I won't explain too much on that. It's pretty self-explanatory. What we're going to do now is move on to sort of a different topic, how muscles grow, and that's called hypertrophy, and how muscles shrink, and that's called atrophy. So you may have heard somewhere in exercise setting, or maybe at the gym, or from somebody who works out a lot, that the only way muscles grow is if they rip and tear. And once they rip or there's some damage caused to the muscle, then the repair is what builds muscle. And that's not actually true. So now, since we've learned about how muscles are put together, we can understand how muscles grow. If we look just at the cellular level, inside of a muscle cell, there are components inside of a muscle cell that are going to increase when you start placing demand or increased demand on a muscle. Exercise, as an example. If you're continually asking a muscle to contract, the muscle is kind of going to go, you know what? She's demanding that I contract more often, so I better increase the structures inside the cell that are responsible for contraction. So muscle cells are going to, when they grow, when you increase demand on them, one of the things they'll do is increase the number of mitochondria. Remember that mitochondria are the organelles that are generating ATP. And ATP is necessary for muscle contraction. ATP is created, and I'll just do it real quick here, is created by this process, that process of cellular respiration, where you have glucose in the presence of oxygen, and through that process of cellular respiration, you have some byproducts, carbon dioxide, water, some heat. But really what we're after, what our cells are after, are molecules of ATP. Well, in order to get this process started, this process of breaking down glucose, we have to split glucose in half. And there are enzymes that are responsible for splitting glucose in half. And I'll just do it like this. This isn't really how it happens, but I'm just going to draw a line right there through glucose. Splitting glucose in half is called glycolysis. So the enzymes that are responsible for splitting glucose in half and kicking off cellular respiration are called glycolytic enzymes. So if your muscle cells need to if your muscle cells need to create more ATP, then it's going to have to break down more glucose. And so therefore, you're going to need more enzymes to break down that glucose. So those glycolytic enzymes increase in concentration. Your muscle cells also increase their glycogen reserves. They start storing glucose. Glycogen is a stored form of glucose. So your muscle cells go, well, if I have to make more ATP, so that I can, and in order to make more ATP, I need more glucose. I better store more glucose inside of my muscle cells. So you have more mitochondria building up or being created inside the muscle cell. You have more glycolytic enzymes building up inside of a muscle cell. And your muscle cells are increasing the amount of glycogen that they store inside of the cells. That causes the individual muscle cell to get larger. It expands. And in addition to that, your cells create more myofibrils. Remember, those are the organelles made of sarcomeres? So when all of these things increase inside of a muscle cell, the muscle cell actually gets larger. And if all of the cells get larger, then all of the fascicles get larger. And if all of the fascicles get larger, what you see is an enlargement of the muscle. And that enlargement of a muscle is called hypertrophy. Now, the reverse is true if you don't use a muscle. Muscle cells are expensive to maintain, metabolically expensive to maintain. So if you're not actively using or placing demand on those muscle cells, it doesn't make any sense to maintain them because they're expensive to maintain. So muscles will actually shrink when they're not being used. And when a muscle shrinks, that's called atrophy. And what you see in atrophy, or what happens in atrophy, is, let me get my pen out here. The number of mitochondria decreases. The amount of glycolytic enzymes decrease. Glycogen reserves decrease. And therefore, the myofibrils start to disappear. So when all of those things decrease, the individual muscle cell decreases in size. If all the cells decrease in size, the fascicles decrease in size, and if the fascicles decrease in size, you see a decrease in the size of the muscle itself. This is called atrophy. This is most easily seen in individuals who, for instance, are paralyzed, who no longer have neurological control over muscle contractions. So if you imagine somebody who is in a wheelchair and are in a wheelchair because they can no longer walk and use those muscles of the legs, you'll see that the muscles of the legs, or overall appearance of the legs, is much smaller. The legs appear quite skinny because they physically can't contract those muscle cells or those muscles. Okay, so the next topic is the different types of skeletal muscle fibers. Also, remember, a skeletal muscle fiber is known as a skeletal muscle cell. When you get to physiology, you'll learn a little bit more about these and how these different types of muscle cells contract. For these next couple of slides, I'd like you to read about fast fibers. They're also called white fibers. And I'd like you to understand how they're structurally and functionally different from the slow fibers, or also called red fibers. There's a fiber type in between that we call intermediate or pink muscle fibers. You can ignore those. If your physiology instructor chooses to teach you about that, great. I know that our book does discuss those intermediate fibers, but you don't need to know about those. So structurally and functionally, I'd like you to know the difference between the slow or red fibers and the fast or white fibers. You can read about this in your textbook. A couple of things I will cover with you now, is in early development. How do our muscles, how are they formed when we're still developing in utero inside mom? And you might remember this, You might remember this term right here, blast. And remember that that means immature. So during fetal development, you have a number of immature muscle cells that are congregating and fusing together. So here's one myoblast. And they're all going to fuse together and create what we've learned about is that mature muscle cell that's multinucleated. Look, each one of these myoblasts has a nucleus. But if all of those myoblasts fuse together to create one cell, what you get is one cell that's multinucleated. Simple as that. And then lastly, what I'd like to cover with you is what happens to our muscles as we age. So naturally, and it will happen to all of us eventually, some slower, some faster, but skeletal muscles are going to atrophy. They're going to get smaller. They're smaller in diameter because mitochondria are becoming reduced, glycogen reserves are becoming reduced. All of those things that we learned about when we were discussing atrophy will happen naturally as we age. Muscles also lose some of their elasticity, so essentially they become stiffer and less resistant to stretch. Because we lose as we age some of the components inside of a muscle cell, things like mitochondria and glycolytic enzymes, our tolerance for exercise decreases. And then also what happens is our ability to recover from muscular injuries decreases as well. So that's it. There are a couple of links here for you that I would have normally asked you to watch if we weren't converting to online teaching. So if you'd like to watch this video at the bottom, this link, this is going to show you exactly how muscle contraction occurs, the entire process, but you don't need to know this for a test. And then also this link right here, if you copy and paste it, shows you how sarcomeres contract. That might be useful just so you can understand how they shorten, but I won't test you on any of that information. Okay, you guys, that's it. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out via email. I'll also soon let you know when we're going to have online office hours. All right, I hope you guys understand everything you need to know about muscles. They're pretty cool, and it's a bummer that we haven't had a chance, or not going to get a chance to cover everything that I'd like to cover, but hey, what are you going to do? It's a pandemic.